According to the conventional view, Russia and China are separate empires that cooperate only to a limited extent. For example, it is claimed the government in Beijing was only informed weeks in advance about Russia's attack on Ukraine. The continuous artillery fire and multiple rocket launchers depleted Russia's arsenals, and Putin is said to have actually believed the illusion that he could take a country the size of France with only 200,000 ill-motivated soldiers and minimal air force operations. NATO is trying to prop Ukraine up long enough for some sort of peace deal, plus get some sort of deal where China doesn't interfere with Ukraine while leaving Taiwan alone. Some US Republicans and related media are already telling conservative target audiences that they should sacrifice Ukraine because they need Russia as a partner against the communist Chinese. But what if Russia and China were already coordinating and planning years ago with regard to an upcoming Ukraine war? What if the Ukraine war is just part of a multi-stage plan to involve NATO in multiple theaters of war around the world at the same time? Any attempt by NATO to pit Russia and China against one another or to make concessions to the two empires would make things worse. China could bring hundreds of thousands of troops and a lot of equipment to Ukraine via the trade route infrastructure it created. Alternatively, they could move hundreds of thousands of North Korean soldiers by train to Ukraine. During the Cold War, communism was, on the surface, the unifying element and at the same time the trigger for tensions between Russia and China. The Western world wondered, is Russia dominating the Chinese Communist Party? Will China tolerate this? For whom does the communist ideology play which role in the face of serious efficiency problems? Do the partners grow apart over time? Would one partner betray the other? Are the Chinese simply too different from the Russians with their ethnicity and their multi-thousand-year-old culture? These doubts repeatedly led to the United States of America in particular selling important technology to the Eastern Bloc and intensifying further trade relations, each with the explanation that they wanted to promote the Chinese as a counterweight to Soviet Russia and vice versa. The end of the Soviet Union seemed to drive Russia and China even further apart. Some conservatives and Soviet defectors warned against a long-term communist strategy during the Cold War, that at some point they will strike the West together. But even those voices were weak, because even they didn't really understand how close the Russians and the Chinese were at the top. After KGB agent Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the West, he published a book purporting to reveal the unfiltered truth entitled New Lies for Old, the Communist Strategy of Deception and Disinformation. Notorious CIA counterintelligence director James Angleton considered Golitsyn the most valuable defector that ever reached the West, and Britain awarded him the Order of the British Empire. He may have provided valuable information on KGB agents and operations, but on the subject of China, which is so important to us today, he seems to be promoting rather than debunking a dangerous myth. He reveals only what one could piece together anyway, namely that Soviet Russia and Communist China at times deliberately lamented their differences publicly for strategic reasons, instead of constantly projecting the image of harmonious, unshakable communist brotherhood to the outside world. Nevertheless, Golitsyn presents the situation as if the two empires had indeed separated very early on and would only cooperate with each other. However, a plethora of information from various sources reveals a tremendous degree of Moscow control over the Chinese communists from the start, even before the revolution under Mao. The Chinese went through Russian training institutions and were constantly tested for their loyalty to Moscow and, if necessary, exchanged. The money came from Russia, the crucial war equipment, and the military advisors. After a successful revolution, China was Sovietized exactly according to Stalin's wishes, just as Eastern European states had been completely taken over by Moscow. According to strict imperial and secret intelligence logic, Russia would have aimed for maximum control and maintained it permanently through secret intelligence saturation. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe relaxed, but in China and North Korea, where Beria and Stalin themselves installed Kim Il-sung as a puppet, there was no liberation from the dictatorships. Why should China have been allowed independence, including nuclear weapons? Why is the possibility that Moscow has completely controlled China since Mao never been specifically addressed and investigated publicly? Why is the lame assessment of KGB defector Anatoly Golitsyn considered the best possible? One must have read the major defectors, but at the same time be aware that those never had access to the highest levels of secrecy, could only see part of the operations at their level, and that after the defection, the info was filtered by Western secret services and only selected bits of information were allowed to end up in the published books. What we expect from real revelations is that actual secrets are revealed and we get genuinely new perspectives. Golitsyn merely reveals things that were barely veiled in the first place. Quote, for example, in June of 1944, Stalin told Averell Harriman, then United States ambassador to Moscow, that the Chinese communists were not real communists, but margarine communists. In August of 1944, Molotov, then Soviet foreign minister, Patrick Hurley, and Donald Nelson, President Roosevelt's two personal representatives in Chongqing, told President Roosevelt that many of the so-called Chinese communists were simply desperate poor people who would forget this political inclination when their economic situation improved. In the summer of 1945, Stalin said that Chinese communism was not good for much. Well, further fake assurances that Chinese communists were not real communists were made by the Soviet leadership in Potsdam in July of 1945 and in Moscow in September of 1945. At the same time, Mao publicly lied that he received too little help from Soviet Russia. Quote, the author Golitsyn learned of a Soviet decision made after secret negotiations with a high-level CCP delegation in Moscow in the fall of 1946 to increase Soviet military aid to the CCP. The Soviet General Staff, Military Intelligence, and the Ministry of Transport were all ordered to give priority to the Chinese Communist Army. Well, it was child's play for Western intelligence services to see through the public statements of Stalin and Mao. Golitsyn reveals nothing special at all and also spreads a devastating misconception. Quote, Mao was told by Stalin that all Soviet intelligence work in China had ceased and that the names of former Soviet agents in China would be disclosed to Chinese intelligence. Russia only gave up a few agents in an attempt to appear to release China into some sort of independence. Likewise, Golitsyn reveals only a few trivia bits to appear to be honestly describing the relationship between Russia and China. Quote, it would be completely wrong to think of China as a Soviet satellite at the time. The extent of Soviet infiltration and control over the Chinese party and government was small compared to that over the Eastern European satellites. It was largely confined to Xinjiang and Manchuria. Why should it have been small? First, it contradicts countless facts, and second, it contradicts basic imperial and intelligence logic. According to Golitsyn, Moscow would have taken a huge risk without securing its own investment. Completely foreign Asians from a completely foreign culture, with a foreign economic and social tradition and starting position, were brought to power in a country that was gigantic in terms of area and population, in the hope that they would not, after a very short time, ignore communism and only do what is useful for their new empire. Golitsyn reveals that Stalin was not entirely honest and kept a few agents and front addresses in China instead of withdrawing and or exposing them to the Chinese. Quote, the gravest of all disagreements arose over the Korean War, which Stalin launched without taking Mao's full confidence. It is not a simple disagreement when Stalin starts a war on China's doorstep, pulls the strings with the North Koreans, and then demands that China provide hundreds of thousands of valuable troops at its own expense and risk losing them altogether. We know now that Mao was in line with the Soviet leadership, as usual, and dutifully mobilized the soldiers. It is unclear whether prior to the Korean War, Stalin really believed American claims that the US had no interest in meddling in Asia. Either way, Stalin was responsible and Chinese troops were crucial. Data from official Chinese sources reported that the Chinese had 114,000 combat deaths, 34,000 non-combat deaths, 340,000 wounded, and 7,600 missing during the war. Golitsyn delivers a manipulative account. Quote, "The Soviets suggested that the Chinese send troops to help the North Koreans. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese initially refused. Only after massive Soviet pressure was exerted, culminating in a secret and personal letter from Stalin to Mao, did the Chinese agree to send volunteers to Korea. Soviet economic and military aid to China increased. On January 17th, 1955, the Soviet government announced that it would support China in setting up nuclear research facilities. Later, the USSR committed to building a nuclear reactor in China, which should be operational by March of 1958. While there were significant concerns among Chinese generals, Golitsyn here perpetuates the legend that Russia and China were vastly separate empires that were not at all enthusiastic about cooperating with each other, and that Russia had to use carrots and sticks extensively. Quote, "The earlier decision to disclose all former Soviet agents in China to the Chinese has been fully enforced with no exceptions." Completely without exceptions? How can Golitsyn be so sure? He was just a major in the KGB. There are many indications that Russia only exposed a few of its own agents as a symbolic gesture. Quote, "Thereafter, at Chinese request, Soviet intelligence dispatched a number of its leading experts on such subjects as scientific reconnaissance, penetrating Western embassies in Moscow, physical protection of nuclear and missile facilities, manufacturing audio surveillance equipment, and conducting sabotage and assassination operations. The status and functions of Soviet advisors, including intelligence and security advisors, were settled to Chinese satisfaction." How can the former KGB guy claim to be so sure? Why should China have been given special status at eye level while states in Eastern Europe were completely under control? It is well known how many purges took place under Mao's rule and how virtually all major Chinese revolutionaries had gone through Russian training camps. It would have been perfectly natural for Moscow to infest the Chinese government apparatus with agents who knew nothing about each other. In this way, traitors to Moscow's interests could be quickly identified and eliminated. Golitsyn does not expose a Russian-Chinese deception, but knowingly or unknowingly participates in a Russian-Chinese deception. Quote, "The role of the advisors was limited to advice and coordination. Interference in the internal administrative affairs of the Chinese services was ruled out. The Soviets really treated the Chinese services as equals in status, if not in experience." Again, the KGB major makes definitive, comprehensive statements with words like out of the question and real. In 1958, according to Golitsyn, the new KGB chief Shelepin was so impressed after a visit to China by the Chinese secret services and their skillful handling of dissidents that he recommended that the KGB learn a lesson from it and learn from the Chinese. In reality, the Chinese had only received basic training from the KGB without being taught how to shake off Russian control and how to spy on Russia. Golitsyn throws the reader a few ultimately worthless chunks of information to make it more believable. Quote, "More than a year after the reported departure of Soviet economic and technical specialists from China in July and August of 1960, at least some of the KGB advisors were still there. A former colleague and friend of the author, who had been sent to China to advise on the physical protection of Chinese nuclear facilities, was still in China in November of 1961. It is the greatest irony that Golitsyn promises clarification that Russia and China faked or exaggerated tensions between each other, but ultimately itself provides misleading information about supposed significant tension. Quote, "The insensitivity of Stalin's handling of Sino-Soviet and other intra-bloc relations, if left uncorrected, would have resulted in a genuine Sino-Soviet split, analog to the Tito split. In fact, the necessary corrective measures were taken in good time. By the end of 1957, there were no more open differences between the members of the bloc. So, it almost came to a real split, which could only be averted by corrective measures? This is as absurd as anyone claiming that a Russian-Polish rupture almost came about because of Stalin's rudeness towards Poland. But after Stalin's death, the Soviets smoothed things over to Polish satisfaction. Stalin or not, Moscow set the line and the other countries had to follow. Real opposition would have been quickly exposed by espionage. Golitsyn rattles off all sorts of fallacious evidence of how divided Russia and China would have been. Quote, "This unofficial evidence, much of it retrospective, pointed to a deterioration in party and diplomatic cooperation in 1959, an end to Soviet military and nuclear cooperation that year, and the cessation of Soviet economic aid to China in 1960. From late 1961, references to Sino-Soviet differences began to appear even in official communist sources. Quote, "Friction and competition between the Soviet and Chinese delegations at the meetings of international front organizations became noticeable. During the second period of schism, the existence of differences was fully acknowledged. An alleged attempt to settle them was made when a senior Chinese party delegation visited Moscow for talks in July of 1963. The talks apparently failed and public polemics began between the parties. Previously secret party letters revealing differences between the parties were published in the Soviet and Chinese press. Some Chinese diplomats were expelled from the Soviet Union for distributing leaflets." Well, Golitsyn is no exposer, sticking rather closely to the usual view that Russia and China are separate and fractious empires that may or may not pull together in the future. Quote, "In the third period, beginning around 1969, the apparent deterioration in Sino-Soviet relations was expressed in both deeds and words. Troop strengths were built up on the Sino-Soviet border. Border incidents broke out between the two countries against the background of mutual accusations of hegemonism. China began publicly and systematically to take an opposite position to the Soviet Union on NATO, the Warsaw Pact, the EEC, Détente, disarmament, European security, and many third world issues, including the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. The fact that Russia and China didn't even break off diplomatic relations or start shooting at each other, but rather lived along side by side, gnashing their teeth, is the great communist deception maneuver that Golitsyn pretends to reveal here. Quote, "The Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Mutual Cooperation and Assistance was not rescinded either. By 1980, each side pledged to assist the other in emergencies." Where exactly in Golitsyn's book is a single noteworthy secret revealed at all? Quote, "Why would the Soviet and Chinese leaders deliberately draw Western attention to the existence of a dispute that they sought to conceal from their own parties and the populace unless they could thereby serve their mutual interests in furthering their recently agreed long-term politics plan?" According to Golitsyn, however, the pact between Russia and China would only be an ordinary pact between two completely separate empires, and as is well known, such calculations can constantly change depending on what the United States, for example, offers. And then we are right back to the idiotic notion that perhaps Russia could be played off against China with concessions and vice versa. The considerable technology sales by the United States to the Eastern Bloc and massive appeasement were based on precisely these ideas. Ultimately, the problems that Germany now has are based on these ideas, namely the energy dependency on Russia and the trade entanglements with China. If China fails as a trading partner due to international tensions, this would endanger the German economy. Had people been publicly aware early on that Russia and China might be one in the same empire, we would not have made ourselves so dependent. Golitsyn strongly accepts virtually every single point of alleged incompatibility between Russia and China. The long-term economic imbalance, the cessation of Soviet economic aid, the failure of communist ideology in practice under Mao, cultural and historical differences, and even classic disputes over territory. Quote, Assertions of Chinese national interests are evident in Chinese claims to Taiwanese, Indian, and Outer Mongolian territory, and in calls for the revision of 19th century unequal treaties that awarded certain Chinese territories to Russia. Soviet national confidence was evident in Soviet attempts to incite revolt in Xinjiang and among tribal groups bordering China, and in Soviet complaints of Chinese border violations, which, according to official Soviet sources, numbered 5,000 in 1962 alone. While Golitsyn warns that at a later stage the option remains for the communist strategists to end the split and adopt the clenched fist strategy, he only superficially focuses on communist ideology, which no longer plays a significant role in Russia today, and otherwise considers Russia and China to be entirely separate. Investigating the question of a secret cartel by the Russians and Chinese inevitably leads to the expanded investigation of whether the British and Americans are also part of the secret cartel. Whether the three superpowers have common roots and would lose their status or even collapse without the continued secrecy of the real situation. The massive Western aid to the Eastern Bloc has been explained in various nonsensical and contradictory ways. One would have intended to help China as a counterweight against Russia, but this doesn't make any sense per se. One would have intended to help Russia as a counterweight against China. This makes no sense at all, and especially with regard to the last point. Why support two opponents at the same time? Then, one would have naively hoped for change through trade. Well, to believe that, key figures in the Anglo-American superpower would have to be unrealistically stupid. China's communist revolution is part of the state cult. Mao is considered the founding father and his Long March a myth. Ultimately, however, it was an operation planned, financed, and monitored by Russia over a long period of time. All major Chinese communists had been educated in Stalin's institutions. Anyone who secretly expressed no loyalty to Moscow was immediately eliminated and replaced. Mao's tough program was adopted verbatim by Stalin. It was Stalin who paid for Mao's equipment and had all these military actions planned. Just as the USSR took Eastern Europe, they took China, and then, for strategic reasons, made it appear that the two communist brother states went their separate ways. Moscow's Sun Yat-sen University was one of several training camps for the Chinese communists as well as for the Kuomintang nationalists. The first rector was Karl Radek, who had become a member of the Central Committee of the CPSU but was thrown out of the party in 1927 and exiled to Siberia. Some guest lectures at the university were even held by Leon Trotsky, who went into exile in 1929 and was murdered by Soviet agents in 1940. There was also the Communist University of the Working People of the East, which was supposed to educate Asian cadres. On behalf of Lenin, Mikhail Borodin established a military academy on a small island near Canton in order to have new officers trained by Soviet military advisors for the Chinese communists and nationalists. Borodin also fell from grace and eventually died in a labor camp. Kang Sheng was tasked with special affairs for political security, which meant something like counterintelligence and that sort of thing. Obtaining cover addresses, shielding meeting points, establishing dead drops, and recruiting informants. The Chinese were frequenting the Soviet consulate in Shanghai, where GRU agents such as Chusov and Koyennikov were based. Those two Russians were in charge of the Chinese Communist Party's combat departments. The necessary money flowed through the Soviet Dalbank, a front organization of the Soviet Secret Service, GPU. Moscow sent Sergei Dalin, who had been observing the Congress of Communist Youth Corps years earlier, and GPU agent Sidorkin. The Kremlin ordered that the Chinese communists had to work with the nationalist Kuomintang for the time being. Russian agent Borodin sought out the most capable people among the Chinese and put Gu Shunjiang in touch with the GPU, who then referred him to a training facility in Vladivostok, where he received thorough training in espionage and armed insurrection. He even made it to Zhou Enlai's deputy. He became his deputy, but was arrested by the Kuomintang and betrayed some of his comrades. Kang Sheng is said to have gone through the GPU training and then built up appropriate intelligence structures for the Chinese Communist Party. He distributed a pamphlet to a select few people, which was essentially a copy of the GPU manual for the basic training of new cadres. Of course, the Russians only needed to pass on part of their intelligence expertise and only exactly as much as the Chinese absolutely needed to carry out their tasks. Neither Sheng nor his comrades learned the secret background of the Russian Revolution and how ancient aristocratic intelligence networks kept socialism under control early on. No, they were only allowed to learn parts of the craft, such as encrypted communication, dead drops, cover addresses, shaking off potential pursuers on the street, recruiting informants, exposing traitors, and reporting unreliable comrades to Moscow. The followers of the Chinese Communist Party were soon disappointed by the party leadership, which was, quote, ready at any time to go to the barricades at the slightest sign from Moscow, regardless of the consequences. Some hasty and failed operations were due to the power struggle in Moscow and St. Petersburg because Stalin was not yet the undisputed dictator and even dismissed his own intelligence chiefs in droves. During the ruthless actions in China, communist officials allowed themselves to be tested to see whether they were consistently implementing orders from Russia without any hesitation or complaints. Distrusting one another and living in paranoia, China's communist leaders were exactly what the Kremlin wanted to ensure against the project slipping away. Each was interchangeable and theoretically could be eliminated at any time. Anyone who criticized the Russians in private with another comrade and harbored any ideas of locking out Russia after the planned revolution ran the risk of being reported as unreliable. Any bodyguards, cooks, domestic servants, or women could actually be Soviet agents and carry out an assassination at any moment. If you messed with the Kremlin, your own wives and children would also be in danger. The 6th Congress of the Communist Party of China was held outside Moscow, in a GPU sanatorium that was thoroughly bugged. The Chinese communists were supposed to set up their own secret service and did so in accordance with their Soviet training. The Soviets also largely determined the CCP's Politburo members. Stalin especially relied on Li Lizan. Lizan considered himself the Lenin of China and Bolsheviked the party according to the Russian model. His comrades were constantly being hunted down by the French, British, mafia gangs, the Kuomintang and Chinese authorities. The spy chief of the Soviet Union's Red Army sent infamous agent Richard Sorge to China to set up an intelligence network. Sorge came from Germany and was considered a companion of Karl Marx. Various organizations were used as camouflage, such as the Soviet Merchant Navy. Kang Sheng may have worked directly for Sorge. Money came from the Metropolitan Trading Company, among others, but Stalin tied the money to specific conditions. Ursula Hamburger, aka Sonia, who later worked against the Nazis and transported information crucial to the war to Russia, was also involved in China. Sorge had recruited her for the GRU. The so-called 28 Bolsheviks arrived in China, all graduates of the Soviet-Russian Sun Yat-sen University. Wang Ming, who was only 25 years old and extremely arrogant, was considered the new star in the sky, Moscow's favorite, modeled after the Russian example. But later in 1941 he refused the self-incrimination and declaration of loyalty demanded by Mao. Soon after he became seriously ill. In his later book, 50 Years of the CCP and the Betrayal of Mao Zedong, Wang claims that Mao tried to have him poisoned. In 1956, Wang went to the Soviet Union for medical treatment and never returned to China until his death. Soviet official Pavel Mif pulled the strings and came to Shanghai to personally oversee what was happening and ensure the CCP was brought into line. There was a meeting surrounded by snipers where all decisions were made. And in 1937, Mif was arrested by the Soviet-Russian Secret Service. He was executed 2 years later. A man called He Mengzhong and his people wanted to resist the coordination by Moscow and convene a party congress, but were brutally wiped out by a hit squad. A comrade is not just a comrade. The Soviet-Russian hotbeds were like factories that continue to churn out new workers for China on an assembly line, political workers. Just as the British had perfected long ago, the Russians applied a whole series of attitude and reliability tests to the young Chinese subjects. Even girls were used to test whether the students cared more about showing off or maintaining secrecy. Stoyanov from the GRU selected the suitable Chinese who corresponded to his ideas. The most elite of the cadre schools was in Moscow and was attached to the Comintern's International Relations Department. Guys like Zhu Enlai, Chen Yun, Peng Zhen, and Kang Sheng had special status and were trained directly by the GPU Secret Service. Koreans, Mongolians, and Japanese were also educated at the Chinese Kitarskaya University. Even the terms used by Chinese agents are from Russia. Various troops were assembled in Russia under Kang's leadership, which would then join Mao's guerrilla forces. Kang and Mao remained fairly close allies for decades. It is well known and well documented that Stalin surreptitiously betrayed socialists abroad who were not in line with Moscow. Why should he deal differently with the socialists in China? Mao is said to have been significantly more independent of Moscow and relatively early on as a guerrilla leader. But as early as 1929, he had depression and various physical symptoms of illness. He had not been raised by the Soviet Union's elite schools and had a penchant for escalating adventures in sex and drugs. But he nonetheless had the support of Stalin, who was known to be hyper-paranoid and demanding the utmost discipline. Stalin and his secret services must have been sure that they could control Mao, and at the same time Mao would have been the right figure to later stage a break with Moscow. Mao had the credit of being a leader in the guerrilla struggle, but he lacked the successes and the backing for his methods at the Comintern. The so-called Long March was a dubious retreat that was later turned into a heroic myth. So Mao was the ideal official for Moscow in several respects because he didn't seem to have any real talent for military and intelligence matters. Nikita Khrushchev said in his memoirs that the Chinese officer Gao Gang had always thoroughly informed the Soviet-Russian intelligence chief Beria, which Chinese revolutionary leader thought in what way. Kang Sheng had been Beria's student. Sheng had also traveled to the middle of the Spanish Civil War to hunt down dissident left-wing anarchists on behalf of Moscow. Gao was ultimately cut off, and Kang Sheng gave the impression that he no longer danced to the tune of the Soviets, but lived in Beijing, very close to the Russian embassy. Peng Dehuai was still attending the Soviet Military Academy in 1957 and wanted to renew the Chinese military. He didn't believe in Mao's nonsense, complained to Khrushchev, and was then cut off. Apparently he wasn't privileged enough to be privy to the staged rupture between the two countries. Sheng, Zhu Enlai, and Lu Zhao attended the CPSU National Congress in Moscow, where they theatrically emitted a bunch of shouting, which had the sole purpose of deceiving world opinion. In 1956, all remaining private companies in China were expropriated, and in the same year the peasants lost ownership of their tools, their animals, their land, and even the right to freedom of movement. You were forced to work on a patch of land owned by the party, you had to sell the grain to the state at fixed prices, and you had no power to change the situation. This corresponds almost exactly to the current definition of serfdom, with the difference that instead of a nobleman, a local party leader exercises control, and on paper everything is in collective public property. Chinese peasants were left with a third less food for their own consumption than before the revolution, which meant that the peasants had neither the energy nor the supplies to dare an uprising against the established order. After the communist victory, citizens were urged to report their fellow men for anything that might be considered suspicious, even if it was possession of a radio receiver, which of course was not comparable to a shortwave transceiver used by spies. Doak Barnett reported in 1949 that Beijing had as many portraits of Soviet leaders as of Chinese leaders. Next to the Chinese flag hung the Soviet one. Newspapers and radio stations in China praised Stalin and the USSR. Mao's right-hand man, Liu Shaoqi, toured Soviet territory, met with Stalin 6 times and held meetings with top ministers. He brought home hundreds of Soviet advisors. Even the Long March that Mao had turned into a founding legend had been paid for by the Soviets in Mexican silver dollars. Stalin incorporated new territories and secret annexes to treaties with China and made the Chinese taxpayer or peasant pay for the many Soviet advisors. The historian Paul Wingrove wrote, Mao's victorious independent revolutionary state was treated in much the same way as the conquered Russian territories in Eastern Europe. China just seemed like territory occupied by the Russians. albeit without large Russian troops and hordes of tanks everywhere, but mostly with intelligence networks and treaty safeguards. Russian advisors occupy the most luxurious suburbs and clubs, sat in all ministries as monders in key positions. This deep penetration of China by Russian secret services was irreversible. Even the later purges failed to change the situation, but rather had the potential to make it worse and eliminate those party officials who genuinely wanted to break away from Russia and or implement a nicer form of socialism. The Soviet news agency TASS became the main source of information in China, and the Sino-Soviet Friendship Society, with 120,000 locations, became something of a Masonic lodge system, just as the colonial power Britain once established Freemasonry, along with sister organizations or front organizations in its colonies. No one was more Stalinist than Mao. No one copied Stalin like Mao. No one else acted in China as if Stalin and the Kremlin set the agenda for everything.